Now, in 1891, a Smithsonian team unearthed a 7-foot skeleton wearing a copper crown in an Illinois mound. And then, well, according to every official record, it simply ceased to exist. I want you to really imagine the scene for a moment. It's a humid afternoon in the American Midwest, right? A team of experts working under the prestigious banner of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology is carefully peeling back layers of earth from a massive burial mound. They expect pottery, maybe some flint tools, but instead, they find him. The excavators, men whose reputations were honestly beyond reproach, stare down at a frame that defies everything they know about human biology. This wasn't just a tall man, you see. This was a titan. He was found reclining in a stone-lined vault, his skull adorned with a circlet of beaten copper that shimmered even after centuries in the dark. Now, this discovery was recorded in the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology. It was signed, sealed, and delivered to the United States government. Names like Cyrus Thomas, the actual man in charge of the Smithsonian's mound explorations, were attached to these findings. This wasn't some tall tale told by a drunkard in a saloon, right? It was a documented scientific fact, backed by the most prestigious institution in the country. But here is where the trail turns cold. I've personally looked for that skeleton. I've searched the museum catalogs, the modern inventories, and I found nothing. How does a physical giant, documented by the highest scientific authority in the land, simply vanish into thin air? I mean, you have to ask yourself, if this was a legitimate piece of American history, why isn't it on display in the National Museum of Natural History? Why is there no photograph, no further analysis, and absolutely no mention of it in any textbook you've ever read? As I dug deeper into the archives, I realized this wasn't just a clerical error or a lost crate in some dusty basement. This 1891 cold case was just the first crack in a much larger, much darker wall. Because the King of Illinois wasn't an isolated incident, you know? He was just the first piece of evidence in what I've discovered was a systematic, century-long purge of a history that they are desperate to keep hidden. Now, if you open a modern textbook, you'll find the story is, well, it's clean, it's simple, it's tidy. They tell us that the thousands of massive earthworks and complex mounds scattered across the American heartland, I mean, they're everywhere, were built by the direct, small-stature ancestors of the indigenous tribes we know today. Any mention of 7, 8, or 9-foot skeletons is dismissed as yellow journalism. You know, the 19th century version of clickbait. Formally, the official narrative wants me to believe that back then, every small-town newspaper editor was just a bored liar looking to sell a few extra copies of the Friday Gazette. But there's a massive, glaring problem with that tidy explanation. It simply doesn't match the paper trail. If these were all just tall tales and circus hoaxes, I mean, why was the scientific establishment so obsessed with them? In the late 1800s, the world's most prestigious institutions, places like the Smithsonian and the Peabody Museum, they didn't just wait for bones to show up at their door. No, they spent a literal fortune. I'm talking the thousands of dollars at a time when a common laborer was lucky to make a buck a day. They hired professional bone hunters. These weren't hobbyists with shovels looking for a thrill, right? They were trained field agents sent out with specific high-stakes orders to excavate these mounds and ship the contents back east in heavy wooden crates. I have to ask you, why would the most respected scientists in the country spend the modern-day equivalent of millions of dollars to track down what they now claim were imaginary giants? You don't invest that kind of capital on a myth. You spend it on a resource. You spend it on something you need to possess. Or perhaps Something you need to make sure no one else ever sees. As I followed the trail of these 19th century bone hunters, you see, the mystery shifted. It was no longer just about what they found in those mounds, but what happened once those crates reached the basement of the museum. Because I've discovered that the disappearance of these remains wasn't a series of accidents or clerical errors. Firmly, it was the result of a cold, calculated policy. A deliberate mandate designed to ensure that the messy reality of America's past was scrubbed clean before it ever reached the public eye. And the person who signed off on that policy, well, they were just getting started. You know, I call this period the era of scientific manifest destiny. Between 1820 and 1880, America wasn't just expanding its borders. It was constructing a brand new identity. And in that construction, right, there was no room for the impossible. Yet, during this so-called golden age of discovery, something, you see, kept rising from the dirt that threatened to derail the entire project. I've looked through the archives, and I mean the numbers are staggering. From the rolling hills of Ohio to the scorched deserts of Nevada, hundreds of reports flooded local newspapers and scientific journals. These weren't just vague accounts or campfire stories, okay? I'm talking about massive skeletons. 7, 8, even 10 feet tall. Whispering. Dark. Many of them shared a chilling, recurring anatomical feature. Double rows of teeth. But as I dug deeper, I realized that the more these remains were found, the faster they were buried. Not by soil, but by silence. You have to understand the stakes for the academic elite of the 19th century. I mean, they were obsessed with a linear, predictable view of human evolution. Calculating? They needed the past to be simple. And they needed the previous inhabitants of this land to fit a specific, primitive mold. Just to justify the expansion of the New World. When a 7-foot-tall skeleton with sophisticated artifacts and strange dental patterns appeared, well, it didn't fit the script. So, the strategy was simple. Categorize every anomaly as an anatomical error, or dismiss it as a native myth. This wasn't a mistake made by clumsy explorers, right? It was a survival tactic for a small group of powerful men. If these giants were real, the history books would have to be burned, and the authority of the men writing them would evaporate overnight. They scrubbed the records until the past looked exactly the way they wanted it to. Look, this level of coordination, it doesn't just happen by chance. It requires a central hand. It requires a command. And that leads me to the most disturbing question of all. Who exactly issued the order to stop the truth? You know, the answer to exactly who issued that order, it lies within a single dusty document from 1894. I call it the smoking gun of the entire conspiracy. It's known as the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology, authored by John Wesley Powell. On the surface, I mean, it looks like a standard piece of government bureaucracy. But if you read between the lines, you realize this was the moment the door to our true history was slammed shut and bolted from the inside. Powell wasn't just a director, right? He was the gatekeeper of the American past. In this report, he effectively banned the giant theory from academia for good. He mandated that every mound, every artifact, and every single set of remains found in North America must be attributed to the ancestors of known tribes. Incredulous, any evidence suggesting a different race, especially one of immense stature, was simply dismissed as a delusion or a mistake. Whispering, overnight, the giants weren't just ignored, they were made illegal to study. But you see, Powell didn't just stop at changing the narrative. He had to deal with the physical evidence. I've spent years tracking the paper trail of 19th century excavations, and the pattern, it's chilling. In town after town, from the riverbanks of Ohio to the deep forests of Wisconsin, eyewitnesses described the same scene. Atmospheric. Excavators would pull a massive 7-foot skeleton from the earth. The local newspapers would run a headline, and then a representative from the Smithsonian would arrive. Quietly, the bones were carefully packed into wooden crates. They were labeled, recorded, and loaded onto trains bound for Washington, D.C. But here's where the trail goes cold. Puzzled, somewhere between the train tracks and the museum floor, these crates, they simply vanished. Thought-provoking, they entered what I can only describe as a black hole of history. I've looked into the modern-day archives, and the silence, it's deafening. When you ask these institutions about the shipments documented in their own early ledgers, well, the records are suddenly missing or misplaced. It's as if these skeletons were never meant to be curated. They were meant to be sequestered. I picture it often, a subterranean vault, miles of shelving hidden beneath the feet of unsuspecting tourists in the capital. Whispering, a place where the most inconvenient truths are kept under lock and key, gathering dust in the dark. The institutions tell us there is nothing to see, but the 19th century accounts tell a very different story. A story of a lost civilization that was crated up and buried for a second time. They thought they could keep these secrets hidden forever by simply making the evidence disappear. But they forgot one thing. Secrets have a way of leaking out, right? And sometimes the most dangerous evidence isn't what's missing. It's what they accidentally left behind. Because as I dug deeper into the Powell report, I found a detail that everyone else missed. A detail that points to something far more terrifying than just large bones. I'm talking about a systematic scrub of our collective memory, See, if these giants were real, and the evidence I've shown you suggests they were, then the entire timeline of human history in North America is, well, it's nothing more than a convenient fabrication. Just think about it. If you can erase an entire race of people who stood 10 feet tall, what else can you hide?
The Smithsonian and the powers that be, they didn't just bury bones, right? They buried the truth of who was actually here before us. They needed a blank slate to write the story of manifest destiny. A story where the land was sparsely populated by people who didn't build cities or complex societies. But the mounds, the copper mines of Lake Superior, and these massive skeletons, they tell a different story. They tell of a civilization that was sophisticated, powerful, and utterly erased, simply because it didn't fit the narrative of the 19th century elite. You see, history isn't just a record of what happened. It's a curated collection of what they decided to leave in. Every time a farmer unearthed a jawbone that could fit around his own head, or a surveyor found a tomb filled with 7-foot warriors in brass armor, the gatekeepers arrived to crate it up and ship it into the shadows. So, I have to ask you, who else is missing? If a giant civilization can be deleted from the record, who else has been silenced to keep our current timeline easy to control? I mean, we are taught to look at the ground and see dirt. But I'm telling you, look closer. The past is a graveyard of secrets, and we've only scratched the surface. If you're the kind of person who refuses to accept the official story, well, then you're in the right place. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found something in your neck of the woods that just didn't make sense? A mound, a strange artifact, or maybe a local legend that the history books ignore? I want to hear your stories.
And if you want to keep digging into the shadows with me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join the search for what's been lost. Because remember, the truth is rarely where they tell you to look.